in the early morning hours of June 24, 2001. In a remote corner of Washington state, a woman vanished without a trace. The last sounds anyone heard were raised voices cutting through the darkness, an argument that would echo through more than 2 decades of silence. For 23 years, a family searched. For 23 years, a question haunted the forested hills of Wahkiakum County. What happened to Susan Ault? The answer lay hidden beneath the dense canopy of the Pacific Northwest wilderness, waiting to be discovered. But this is not just a story about a missing person. This is a story about a predator who wore a cowboy hat and carried a guitar. A man who charmed women in dimly lit taverns with country songs, only to leave devastation in his wake. This is the story of Susan Lynn Ault, a woman who loved horses, struggled with demons, and disappeared into the night with a man known only as Cowboy Mike. What you're about to hear is a journey through darkness and, finally, after more than 2 decades, a measure of light. This is a true crime investigation that spans from the remote trailer parks of rural Washington to the cutting-edge laboratories where DNA finally spoke the truth. Let that sink in for a moment. 23 years. That's how long Susan's family waited for answers. To understand this case, you first need to understand Susan. She wasn't just a statistic, a name in a missing persons database, or a cold case file gathering dust in a small-town sheriff's office. Susan Lynn Ault was a living, breathing person with passions, struggles, dreams, and a family who loved her deeply. Born on September 25, 1961. Susan grew up with a fierce independence that both defined and complicated her life. Standing 5 feet 8 inches tall with brown hair and striking green eyes, Susan had a presence about her, a toughness born from life's hard lessons, yet, underneath it all, a vulnerability that those closest to her recognized. If there was one thing that defined Susan Ault, was her love for horses. She wasn't a casual rider. Susan was an experienced equestrian who could handle even the most difficult animals. Her sister, Lori Ault, would later recall how Susan's saddle and riding helmet remained in her Federal Way home. Silent reminders of the passion that once drove her sister. There's something poignant about that image. Susan could handle 1,000-pound animals with temperaments that would frighten most people. She had the confidence, the skill, the determination to master horses that others couldn't manage. That same stubborn confidence would later extend to the men in her life, fatal miscalculation that would ultimately cost her everything. But Susan's life wasn't defined by triumphs alone. Since high school, she had battled a drug problem that she sometimes fought head-on and sometimes tried to hide. It's important to understand this not as a character flaw, but as a struggle, one that millions of people face, often in silence, often without the support they need. This battle had consequences that rippled through her family. Susan had a daughter, but circumstances had led to other family members taking on the role of raising her child. It's a detail that speaks to the complexity of Susan's situation. She loved her daughter, but her struggles made consistent parenting impossible. 14 months separated Susan from her older sister, Lori Ault. Lori practiced family law in Tacoma and had her own challenges at home, including caring for an autistic son while maintaining her legal practice and supporting her husband. Despite these responsibilities, the bond between the sisters remained strong. Lori would later describe Susan as alternately tough and needy, stubborn but naive. It's a description that captures the contradictions that made Susan human. We all contain multitudes. All harbor contradictions. Susan was no different. By 2001, Susan was 39 years old and, once again, on the rebound from a failed relationship. She'd had a string of them relationships that didn't work out. Men who weren't right for her, promises that dissolved like morning fog. Each failed relationship took something from her, yet she kept trying, kept hoping, kept searching for connection and stability. She was working as a waitress at a Baronist, Work that kept her going, but didn't provide the kind of security or comfort she might have hoped for in her late 30s. After experiencing a brief period of homelessness, Susan was trying to get back on her feet, trying to find solid ground in a life that had too often felt like quicksand. It was during this vulnerable period that Susan met a man who would change everything. Before we can understand what happened to Susan Ault, we need to understand the man she became involved with. His name was Michael John Braae, but everyone knew him by his nickname, Cowboy Mike. Michael Braae was born in 1960 and cultivated a very specific image: Western hats, cowboy boots, and a guitar slung over his shoulder. He fancied himself a country singer and songwriter. He frequented small-town taverns throughout Washington and Oregon, places where he could perform his country songs and, more importantly, meet women. Braae had a particular drink of choice, Yukon Jack with a shot of lime juice, known as a snake bite. Even his drink order seemed calculated to enhance his country western mystique. The nickname, Cowboy Mike, came from his western attire and his habit of serenading women with his guitar at out-of-the-way taverns. It's important to understand that this wasn't just fashion. It was a carefully constructed persona designed to attract a very specific type of woman. Michael Braae targeted women with troubles and needs. Women who were vulnerable, who were looking for connection, who might see in this guitar-playing cowboy a chance at something different. By the time he met Susan Ault, Braae had already established a terrifying pattern. He had a record of 42 various convictions dating back to the mid-1990s. Think about that number. 42 convictions. This wasn't a man who made one or two mistakes. This was a career criminal who had been given chance after chance by a system that failed to protect the women in his path. In 2001, Braae was supposed to be under supervision by the Washington State Department of Corrections. However, due to a paperwork mix-up and misclassification as a low-risk offender when he should have been classified as higher risk, the doc lost track of him. This catastrophic failure would have deadly consequences. Authorities suspected Braae in the murder of Alina Larson, a 37-year-old homeless woman who disappeared in September 1997 from Clackamas County, Oregon. She was last seen arguing with Braae, and her skeletal remains were found in a field more than a year later. He was also suspected of killing Deborah Van Leuven, 45, of Lacey, who dated him in 1997 and then vanished in Douglas County. Though no charges were ever filed in that case, the pattern was clear to investigators. Even if they couldn't yet prove it, Michael Braae met women, often vulnerable women, established relationships with them, and then they disappeared or were found dead. Braae lived in a 1970s-era trailer on what he called a mini-farm in Pierce County. It was from this base that he would venture out to bars and taverns, guitar in hand, looking for his next victim. He was smooth-talking and charming in the moment. Bartenders would later report that women seemed comfortable with him, that they would dance with him all night as if they'd known him for years. But that charm was a mask covering something far darker: the exact timeline of when Susan Ault first met Michael Braae varies slightly in different accounts. Some sources indicate they met in December 2000, while others suggest it was March 2001. What we know for certain is that it happened during one of the most vulnerable periods of Susan's life. Braae met Susan when she was on the rebound from the latest in a string of failed relationships. She was working as a waitress in a bar he frequented. Picture the scene: a small-town bar, probably not very crowded on a weeknight. Susan working her shift, serving drinks, trying to make ends meet. And there's Braae sitting at the bar, or perhaps on a small stage with his guitar, playing country songs, nursing his signature snakebite drink. For Susan, still smarting from her most recent breakup, here was a man who seemed different. He was a musician, a cowboy, Someone who seemed to understand life's rough edges because he sang about them. He probably made her laugh. He probably listened. He probably said all the right things after meeting. Susan moved in with Braae, initially staying in a recreational vehicle with him. She had been experiencing homelessness for a short time, and Braae offered what seemed like a solution, just 2 weeks after meeting him. Susan moved in with her new boyfriend, Braae. 2 weeks. That's how quickly Susan made a decision that would determine the rest of her life, or rather, how quickly that life would end. Looking back with the clarity of hindsight, it's easy to judge. It's easy to say she should have been more careful, should have taken more time, should have seen the warning signs. But Susan was 39 years old, struggling financially, dealing with homelessness, and likely hoping that this relationship might be different from all the others that prowled. We make decisions based on the information we have at the moment, colored by our circumstances and our hopes. Susan made the decision that seemed right to her at that time. She couldn't have known that Michael Braae was a predator who had left a trail of missing and murdered women across the Pacific Northwest. Eventually, Susan moved out of the RV and relocated to a trailer on a childhood friend's property in Rosburg, Washington. Braae continued to visit her there. Rosburg. Let's talk about this place for a moment, because understanding the location is crucial to understanding why this case proves so difficult to solve. Rosburg is an unincorporated community in Wahkiakum County, Washington, located on the Grays River near Washington State Route 4, about 15 miles northwest of Cathlamet. To call Rosburg remote would be an understatement. The community has a population of just 370 to 468 people. Wahkiakum County itself is the second smallest county in Washington state by population, with only about 4,000 residents total. This isn't a place where you have neighbors keeping an eye on every coming and going. This isn't a suburban neighborhood where unusual activity gets reported to police within minutes. This is rural Washington at its most isolated, dense forests, winding roads, properties separated by considerable distances. Rosburg has a post office, the Grays River Valley Community Center at Johnson Park, and the Rosburg Hall. That's essentially it. There's a store for basic supplies. But this is a community where people know how to be self-sufficient because they have to be. This isolation becomes critically important when we consider what happened to Susan in a densely populated area. Someone might have heard something, seen something, reported something. But in Rosburg, on a property where Susan was staying in a trailer, separated from other homes by trees and distance, sounds don't carry the same way. Screams can disappear into the forest. A vehicle can come and go in the middle of the night without anyone noticing. The very remoteness that might have appealed to Susan the peace. The quiet, the distance from her troubles became the perfect environment for a predator to operate without witness. Without interruption, without accountability, we now arrive at the day that changed everything. Sunday, June 24, 2001. It was early summer in Washington state, the days long. The evenings warm, the kind of weather that makes people forget that darkness always comes eventually. Susan Ault was last seen outside the trailer, where she was staying on a friend's property in Rosburg, Washington, in the early morning hours of June 24, 2001. Witnesses reported that Susan and Michael Braae had an argument that day. The couple was heard fighting outside the trailer. Think about what this means. People heard them arguing. The voices were loud enough, animated enough, angry enough that others took notice. This wasn't a quiet disagreement. This was a fight. What were they fighting about? We don't know with certainty. Were they arguing about their relationship? About money? About Susan wanting to end things with Braae? About his other women, because by this point in June 2001, Braae was already involved with multiple women across Washington state. The content of that argument died with Susan. But what we do know is that after that argument, no one ever saw Susan Ault alive again. She was last seen wearing a blue shirt and tan pants. That's what Susan had on when she walked out of her life forever simple, everyday clothes. She wasn't dressed for a trip. She wasn't packed to leave. She was just ... there. And then she wasn't. The phrase early morning hours is significant. This wasn't the middle of the afternoon with people around. This was when the world is quiet, when most people are asleep, when screams can echo through forests without reaching ears that might help in rural Rosburg. In the dark hours of early morning, Michael Braae had privacy. He had isolation. He had opportunity while we can't know every detail of what occurred. The case is still under investigation as a homicide. We can piece together a terrible picture. From what investigators believe, the argument escalated. Perhaps Susan tried to end the relationship. Perhaps she confronted Braae about something. Perhaps she simply said or did something that triggered his rage that had already been unleashed on other women, a rage that would be unleashed on more women in the weeks to come. What happened next was an act of violence that would echo through more than 2 decades. After that night, after that argument, Susan's life ended. But Braae's crime spree was just beginning. Within weeks, he would leave more victims in his wake, confirming the pattern that investigators had been suspecting but couldn't yet prove. When someone disappears, there's often a delay before anyone realizes something is wrong. Not everyone has daily check-ins with family. Not everyone has a job that will notice if they don't show up. Susan's situation was complicated by her circumstances. She was somewhat isolated in Rosburg. Her support network was limited, and her lifestyle didn't include regular, predictable contact with family members. We don't have a detailed public record of exactly when Susan's family realized she was missing or who first reported it. What we do know is that by the time authorities became involved, Susan had already been gone for some time. Susan vanished in June 2001 after she and Braae fought at the trailer they shared in Rosburg. No one saw her alive after the night she and Braae were heard fighting, about a month after Susan disappeared. Some of her personal items were discovered at a rest stop off Interstate 5, near the Tuttle River and the town of Castle Rock, Washington. Her purse and credit cards were found at this location. Let's pause and consider what this means. A month went by. 30 days. In that time, Susan's purse and credit cards sat at that rest stop, exposed to weather, to passers-by, to the possibility of being overlooked entirely. The location is significant. The rest stop is off Interstate 5 near Castle Rock, near the Tuttle River. This was along a route that someone could take leaving Wahkiakum County, heading north or south on the interstate. This is where we can start to reconstruct what might have happened. If you've committed a crime and have your victim's belongings, you need to dispose of them. But you also can't be too obvious about it. A rest stop offers a certain amount of anonymity, lots of people coming and going. Trash cans where things can be disposed of. Places where a purse can be dropped and might not be noticed for hours or days. Susan's sister Lori believed that the rest stop where the purse was found was too well lit to be where Susan's body was disposed of. Lori theorized that Susan was in the back of a pickup truck and was dumped somewhere along Highway 4 before reaching the bright lights of Kathlemont. She believed Braae then realized he still had Susan's purse in his vehicle and pulled over at the rest stop to throw it away. This theory makes tactical sense. You're driving in the dark with a body in your truck bed. You want to dispose of it in darkness, away from potential witnesses. But afterward, you realize you still have evidence: a purse, credit cards, identification. So you stop at a rest stop and get rid of it, in tiny Wahkiakum County. The sheriff's lone detective, Mike Braae, kept Susan's missing person file close by his desk. Think about that for a moment. One detective in the entire county, This wasn't Seattle or Tacoma with dozens of investigators and extensive resources. This was a rural county where the sheriff's department was small. Budgets were tight and resources were limited. Detective Bulch did what he could with what he had. He followed leads. He investigated. He even traveled out of state to question Braae, who refused to talk, but without a body, without witnesses. Without physical evidence tying Braae to Susan's disappearance beyond the circumstantial, the case stalled. Susan became one of many missing persons, a file that got reviewed periodically but never closed. Never forgotten, but also never solved. Lori Altzion took it upon herself to search for her sister. Despite having a demanding job as a family law attorney in Tacoma, a husband, and an autistic son to care for, Lori spent weekends walking the rough country off Highway 4. Picture this: a professional woman, a mother, a wife, spending her precious free time walking through forests and along highways, looking for any trace of her sister, looking in ditches, looking in blackberry thickets, looking anywhere that a body might have been hidden. Lori would later say, "It's one thing to lose somebody, another to not know and have these dreams that torture you. I don't know if I'm able to lead a normal life. I think about her every day, especially when I see the leaves falling off trees. Today I was stuck on the freeway and looked at the blackberry bushes to the side of the road and wondered, hey, is there a body over there?" This is what it means to have a loved one disappear. It's not just the loss, it's the not knowing. It's the permanent question mark that hangs over every day. It's seeing potential grave sites everywhere you look. 2 summers and 2 winters passed after Susan vanished. Lori eventually spoke with a pathologist who told her that enough time had passed that she might not even recognize human remains if she were standing next to them. After that conversation, Lori's long walks to search for her sister came to an end. Imagine being told that. Imagine the moment when you realize that even if you found your sister, you might not know it. The hope that had driven those searches, the hope of finding Susan, of bringing her home, of having answers, that hope had to be put to rest. Lori later said, "Now I'm doing nothing. Just waiting for fate to find her." While Susan's family searched and grieved, Michael Braae wasn't finished. In fact, Susan's murder was just the beginning of a violent spree that would terrorize Washington state in the summer of 2001. Let's be clear about the timeline here, because it's crucial to understanding the full scope of what happened. June 24, 2001. Susan Ault disappears after arguing with Braae and Rosburg 6-7. 2001. Lori Jones meets Braae at a bar in Olympia July 8. 2001. Lori Jones found dead July 13. 2001. Marshall Morgan shot in the head in Yakima same day. Karen Peterson salted in Yakima July 20. 2001. Braae captured after dramatic chase. That's less than a month. Less than 30 days between Susan's disappearance and Braae's capture. In that short window, multiple women's lives were destroyed. Lori Jones was 44 years old, a single mother of 2 living in Lacey, Washington. She shared an apartment with her 11-year-old daughter, Eliza. On July 6, 2001, Lori had planned to go on a date with David Bowman, a man she'd met online. Her daughter Eliza was going fishing for the weekend with a family friend. But at the last minute, Lori and Bowman had an email argument, and the date was canceled. Think about that for a moment. 1 email argument, 1 canceled date. And Lori's life took a completely different trajectory, one that would end in her death, instead of her planned romantic date. Lori ended up alone at Bailey's Lounge, also called Bailey's Motor, in Olympia. That's where she met Michael Braae. The bartender, Michael Ducklever, would later tell police that Lori and Braae danced together all night like they knew each other. Both were drinking Canadian Whiskey. Lori favored Crown Royal on the rocks, while Braae drank his signature Yukon Jack with lime juice. At some point during the night, Lori and Braae left the bar together. They went back to Lori's apartment in the Summer Ridge Apartments complex. When Lori's 11-year-old daughter Eliza came home on Sunday, July 8th, she couldn't reach her mother. The apartment manager unlocked the door. Inside, they found Lori's body hidden under her bed, naked except for a pillowcase over her head. She had been raped and strangled. Imagine being that 11-year-old girl. Imagine coming home from a fishing trip and finding your mother dead. The psychological trauma of that moment would reverberate through her entire life. Investigators found Braae's DNA on Lori's body and his fingerprint on a window blind in her apartment. The fingerprint matched with Braae, who'd been in the system since 1979. Shoplifting arrest in Pierce County Police also found a receipt that helped them trace Braae back to Bailey's Motor Bar. The bartender identified him as the man who left with Lori that night for the first time. Investigators had solid physical evidence tying Braae to a murder. But by the time they identified him as a suspect, he'd already left the area. Marshall Morgan was Braae's on-again, off-again girlfriend. On July 13, 2001, just days after Lori Jones was found murdered, Morgan and Braae were together in Yakima at a Western-style bar called Susie's Saloon. Later that day, Morgan turned up in a ditch with a gunshot wound to the head. She was 50 years old. The bullet to her brain caused severe injuries. Morgan identified Braae as the person who shot her. Her son Adam, who was just 14 years old at the time, came home from a friend's house to hear the news that would destroy his childhood. As Adam later said, "He ruined my life." It took a long time to get out a hole like that. When Morgan's case went to trial in 2006, her condition had deteriorated so badly that she could no longer testify. The jury deadlocked 11-1, and the judge declared a mistrial, but Morgan survived. Despite the bullet to her head, despite the brain injury, she lived. Years later, after settlements with the state, Dom Morgan spoke about rebuilding his relationship with his mother. "We're just going to build on our future. She's got grandkids now that I want her to be a part of. We can start a whole new family." Just hours after shooting Marshall Morgan, Braae returned to Susie's Saloon. He was drinking snake bites and wearing his signature cowboy hat, gray shirt, jeans, and cowboy boots. He introduced himself to Karen Peterson. Braae followed Peterson to her Yakima home, where they encountered her 14-year-old daughter, Veronica Culp, and Culp's 19-year-old boyfriend, Jeremy Klaus. They made small talk in the living room. Braae asked if anybody had a guitar. According to court documents, Braae then assaulted Peterson in her own home. The details of the assault are disturbing enough that we won't recount them in full here. But it's another example of Braae's pattern: charm, isolation, violence. By this point, police were looking for Braae in connection with Lori Jones' murder. But he'd left Western Washington and was moving through different communities, always one step ahead of law enforcement. Braae was spotted in the small town of Glenoma, where he showed up at a garage sale and asked to donate some video equipment. He then befriended a woman named Brenda Keene and spent the night with her. Brenda wasn't harmed, but when she saw Braae's picture in the newspaper the next morning, she called the tip line and gave police a description of Braae's car and license plate number. Brenda Keene's tip would prove crucial. She potentially saved her own life by recognizing Braae from the news. And her information gave law enforcement exactly what they needed to track him down. On July 20, 2001, a delivery truck driver recognized Braae's blue Nissan pickup at a truck stop on Interstate 84 near the Idaho-Oregon border. When police arrived to arrest him, Braae woke up and the chase was on. Captain Leroy Cords of the Payette County, Idaho Sheriff's Office described how Braae tried to elude police by getting on and off the highway. But officers stayed in pursuit. The chase lasted 40 miles and reached high speeds. Police eventually deployed a spike strip, which deflated at least one of Braae's tires. Braae stopped his vehicle on the road and jumped over the railing of a 40-foot-high bridge, plunging into the Snake River below. Police sent a canine unit after him. In a disturbing display of his willingness to harm any living creature, Braae tried to drown the police dog. Officers in a boat finally apprehended him and pulled him from the river. The manhunt was over. Cowboy Mike's reign of terror had lasted less than a month. But in that time, he'd killed at least one woman and likely more, shot another, assaulted others, and led police on one of the most dramatic chases in Pacific Northwest history. At the time of his arrest, Braae was driving a pickup truck registered to Susan Ault, Susan's truck. Think about that. He'd killed her or disposed of her body. And then he continued driving around in her vehicle, using her property as if she'd never existed. It was the ultimate disrespect to her memory. A final insult added to the permanent injury he'd inflicted. Michael. Braae's arrest didn't immediately lead to justice for all his victims. In fact, the legal process would take years, and some cases would never result in charges at all. A judge initially sent Braae to 9.5 years in prison in Idaho for aggravated assault and eluding an officer during the pursuit. This was his first conviction, based solely on the chase and his actions in Idaho. But investigators knew Braae had done far worse. They had multiple murder cases to build, multiple victims crying out for justice. Braae became infamous for trying to break out of prison. After his arrest, he attempted to escape at least 5 times. His last escape attempt was in 2005, when he picked a lock with a toothbrush and tried to escape through a crawlspace in the Yakima County Jail. Each escape attempt demonstrated that Braae was exactly what investigators had believed all along: a dangerous, cunning predator who would stop at nothing to regain his freedom. It took 7 years from Lori Jones' murder for her case to go to trial. 7 years of preparation, evidence gathering, and legal maneuvering. The trial took place in Thurston County Superior Court in May 2008. Deputy Prosecutor John Tunheim presented the case, highlighting the DNA evidence found on Jones' body and Braae's fingerprint on the window blind in her apartment. During the trial, Braae testified that he had sexual intercourse with Lori on that night but denied having anything to do with her death. It was a desperate defense, trying to explain away the DNA evidence while denying the murder itself. After a 3-week trial, the jury began deliberations on Wednesday. They deliberated for 2.5 hours before finding Braae guilty of first-degree murder and rape. 2 months after the verdict, a judge sentenced Braae to nearly 48 years in prison. Finally, justice for Lori Jones. Finally, accountability. But it had taken 7 years, and it was justice for only one of Braae's many victims. Despite strong suspicions, Braae was never charged in several other cases. Valina Larson, the 37-year-old homeless woman who disappeared in 1997 after being seen arguing with Braae, whose skeletal remains were found in a field more than a year later. Deborah Van Leuven, 45, of Lacey, who dated Braae in 1997 and then vanished in Douglas County, and, of course, Susan Ault, although police called Braae the prime suspect in her disappearance. And although he was driving her truck when captured, he was never charged with her murder. Why not? Without a body, without physical evidence at a crime scene, prosecutors face enormous challenges. The legal standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, and without remains, without a crime scene, building a case becomes incredibly difficult in the years following Braae's crimes. Multiple victims' families filed lawsuits against the Washington State Department of Corrections. The lawsuits alleged that the doc negligently supervised Braae when he was on parole. Despite his extensive criminal history, the doc misclassified him as a low-risk offender, which resulted in minimal supervision. All four families eventually settled their cases with the state for a total of $6.4 million. That money could never bring back the murdered women or heal the trauma inflicted on survivors. But it was at least an acknowledgement that the system had failed catastrophically. If the doc had done its job properly, if Braae had been supervised as he should have been, Susan Ault and Lori Jones might still be alive today. Currently, Michael John Braae is housed at the Washington State Penitentiary under strict supervision. According to prison records, he'll be eligible for release in 2056, when he would be 96 years old. Given his age and his sentence, it's likely that Michael "Cowboy Mike" Braae will die in prison, never having faced justice for most of his victims. After the initial investigation, after Braae's conviction for Lori Jones' murder, Susan Ault's case went cold. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but cold. The file stayed on Detective Bolch's desk. Lori continued to think about her sister every day. But with no new leads, no new evidence, the case simply waited. Cold cases are haunting things. They represent unsolved puzzles, unanswered questions, and unresolved grief. For the investigators who worked them initially, cold cases can feel like failures, cases they couldn't close, victims they couldn't bring home in Wahkiakum County. With its limited resources and small department, Susan's case was one of several unsolved disappearances. The entire county had a population of less than 4,000 people. The sheriff's department did what it could, but without new evidence or breaks in the case, there was only so much they could do. Think about what happens in 20 years. Lives change entirely. The 11-year-old girl who found her mother murdered grows up. The 14-year-old boy whose mother was shot rebuilds his life. Lori Altsayen's autistic son gets older. Seasons pass, say 4 of them. Holidays come and go, 20 Thanksgivings, 20 Christmases, 20 birthdays that Susan never saw. Technology advances too. In 2001, DNA technology was already being used in criminal investigations, but it wasn't what it is today. The ability to analyze degraded samples to extract DNA from bone, to use genetic genealogy to identify unknown remains, these techniques have evolved dramatically during those 20 years. Other cold cases were being solved. Other missing persons were being found. Each year brought new techniques, new technologies, new reasons for hope. But Susan remained missing. Her case remained unsolved. The forest that had swallowed her kept it secret. On February 19, 2021, nearly 20 years after Susan vanished, someone was in the KM Mountain area of Wahkiakum County. The area is remote, forested, exactly the kind of place where hikers and outdoors enthusiasts might wander. At 2:48 p.m., human remains were found on KM Mountain. The coroner was immediately notified. The remains found were partial, specifically a skull. After nearly 20 years in the Pacific Northwest wilderness, exposed to weather, animals, and the passage of time, little else remained. This is the reality of missing persons cases that go unsolved for decades. Bodies don't remain intact. They decompose, scatter, get reclaimed by nature. What Lori Altsayen had been told years earlier was true. After enough time passes, remains become unrecognizable. Wahkiakum County Coroner Don Bigelow was called to the scene. He noted the involvement of Kathy Taylor from the Washington State Physical Anthropologist's office, praising her expertise. Bigelow stated, "Taylor is a rock. Thank goodness. With her help, there hasn't been an unidentified set of remains that has been found in Wahkiakum County in the last 12 to 15 years that has not been identified." But Bigelow also cautioned, "This one is going to take a while." It indicated there would be a further search of the area for clues when weather conditions permitted. Identifying remains that have been exposed to the elements for 2 decades is not a quick process. It requires specialized expertise, advanced technology, and crucially something to compare the DNA against. The remains were sent for analysis. Forensic anthropologists examined the skull. But who was this person, male or female? How long had they been there? How did they die? For nearly 3.5 years, the remains found on KM Mountain in February 2021 remained unidentified. They were logged, stored, tested, but unnamed. Case files were reviewed. Missing persons databases were searched. But connecting these particular remains to one particular missing person required that final piece of the puzzle. A genetic match. In November 2024. Nearly 23.5 years after Susan Ault vanished from that trailer in Rosburg, science finally spoke her name to identify the remains. The Wahkiakum County Sheriff's Office obtained a DNA sample from Susan Ault's daughter. Think about what this means for Susan's daughter. She'd been raised by other family members. She'd grown up without her mother, and now, as an adult, she was being asked to provide DNA to confirm whether her mother's remains had been found. The DNA genealogy tests were made possible with help from the Washington State Physical Anthropologist's Office and Bode Technology Group, Inc. These new tests utilize DNA from family members and are considered extremely accurate. The results came back. Match. The remains found on KM Mountain in 2021 were definitively identified as Susan Lynn Ault. In late November 2024, Wahkiakum County officials publicly announced that the remains had been identified as those of 39-year-old Susan Lynn Ault, who had vanished from the Rosburg area in 2001. Ault's case has been reclassified from a missing person case to a homicide investigation. That word homicide carries enormous weight. It means that investigators have determined Susan's death was not accidental, not natural, but the result of intentional criminal action. Someone murdered Susan Ault and left her body in the wilderness to be reclaimed by nature. Wahkiakum County Coroner Dan Bigelow stated in a press release, "These findings do not end the investigation into her disappearance, but at least we can put to rest some doubts for her family and friends." Put to rest some doubts. What an understated way to describe what this identification meant. For Lori Alcion, who had spent years searching forests and highways, who had lived with the torture of not knowing, this was finally an answer. Not the answer she wanted. No one wants to learn their loved one was murdered, but an answer nonetheless. The identification of Susan's remains opened a new chapter in the case, but it didn't close the book. Anyone with information regarding Susan Ault's disappearance is asked to contact SGT Brian Hornback at hornbackko.wahkiakum.wa.us or 360-795-3242. Or under Sheriff Gary Howell at howllg@co.wahkiakum.us or 360-795-3242. Even with Susan identified, even with the case reclassified as a homicide, investigators still need to build a prosecutable case. They need evidence that can stand up in court. They need to prove not just that Susan was murdered, but who murdered her and how. Michael Braae is already in prison, serving 48 years for Lori Jones' murder. He's the prime suspect in Susan's death. He was the last person seen with her. She disappeared after arguing with him, and he was driving her truck when captured. But suspicion isn't enough for a murder conviction. Prosecutors need evidence that can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. After 23 years, after exposure to the elements, after the passage of so much time, what evidence might still exist? Forensic analysis of the remains might reveal cause of death. There might be DNA evidence. There might be other physical evidence found in the area around where Susan's skull was discovered. The investigation continues. Because justice for Susan Ault remains incomplete. Now that we know Susan's Remains have been found and identified. We can examine the most likely scenarios for what happened to her on June 24, 2001. While the investigation is ongoing, and we must be careful not to prejudice any potential legal proceedings, we can analyze the available evidence and develop theories based on what we know. Witnesses reported that Susan and Braae had an argument on June 24, 2001. They were heard fighting outside the trailer where Susan was staying. Susan was last seen arguing with Braae in the early morning hours. After that argument, she was never seen alive again. The timing is significant. Braae had already killed before investigators suspected him in murders from 1997. He would kill again just 2 weeks later when he murdered Lori Jones on July 7, 2001. His pattern was established. He killed women he was involved with. The argument escalated. Perhaps Susan wanted to end the relationship. Perhaps she confronted Braae about his involvement with other women. Perhaps she discovered something about his past. Whatever triggered it, the argument turned violent. In the early morning hours, in isolated Rosburg, with no neighbors close enough to intervene, Braae murdered Susan. The method remains unknown until forensic analysis of her remains can determine cause of death. But based on his known MO with other victims, strangulation is possible. After killing Susan, Braae faced the problem of disposal. He couldn't leave her at the trailer that would be immediately discovered. He needed to hide the body. About a month after Susan disappeared, her purse and credit cards were found at a rest stop off Interstate 5, near the Tuttle River and the town of Castle Rock. Susan's remains were found in the KM Mountain area in Wahkiakum County. Let's look at the geography. Rosburg is in Wahkiakum County. To get to Interstate 5 and Castle Rock from Wahkiakum County, you would travel Highway 4 west to Longview, then north on I-5. The KM Mountain area where Susan's remains were found is in Wahkiakum County, potentially along this general route. Susan's sister Lori Ault developed a theory based on her extensive searches. She believed Susan was transported in the back of a pickup truck. She theorized that Susan was dumped somewhere along Highway 4, in a dark area before reaching the bright lights of Cathlamet. Lori believed the rest stop where the purse was found was too well lit to be where Susan's body was disposed. Lori's theory continued. After disposing of Susan's body along Highway 4, Braae realized he still had her purse in his vehicle. He then drove to the rest stop near Castle Rock and threw the purse in the river, or a trash can there. This theory makes logical sense from a criminal's perspective. You want to dispose of a body in darkness, away from potential witnesses. But personal belongings that could identify the victim need to be disposed of separately. And a busy rest stop with trash facilities provides that opportunity. Susan disappeared on June 24, 2001. Her purse was found about a month later. This timing suggests Braae might have kept her belongings with him for a period, perhaps not realizing they were still in his vehicle until after he'd committed other crimes. Remember, by the time Susan's purse was found, Braae had already killed Lori Jones July 7th and shot Marshall Morgan July 13th. He was on the run, moving quickly from place to place. He might have discovered Susan's purse in his truck and realized he needed to dispose of it quickly. The location where Susan's remains were found raises questions. Why there? What made that location suitable for hiding a body? Isolation. The location needed to be remote enough that a vehicle could stop without attracting attention. Cover, dense forest or undergrowth to hide. A body from casual view. Access, a way to get there with a vehicle, but not so obvious that others would be there. Knowledge. The killer needed to know about the location. Michael Braae lived in Pierce County, but frequented bars and taverns throughout Washington and Oregon. He knew the area. He'd been to Rosburg multiple times to visit Susan. He would have been familiar with the roads, the forests, the remote areas where a body could be hidden. The KM mountain area fit all these criteria. Remote enough for privacy, forested enough for concealment, accessible by vehicle, and in an area Braae knew from his time in Wahkiakum County. One thing that stands out when examining Braae's timeline is how quickly his violence escalated in 2001. Besides Susan Ault, Braae was suspected in the deaths of at least 3 other women: Lori Jones, Valina Larson, and Deborah Van Leuven. Susan disappeared June 24th. Lori Jones was killed. July 7th, Marshall Morgan was shot. July 13th, all within 3 weeks. This wasn't a killer who murdered once and then laid low. This was a serial predator in the midst of a rampage. What triggered this acceleration? Several factors likely contributed. Lack of consequences. Braae was supposed to be under doc supervision but wasn't being properly monitored. He'd gotten away with murder before and wasn't being stopped. Escalating needs. Serial killers often find that the satisfaction they get from violence diminishes over time, driving them to kill more frequently. Loss of control. By mid-July 2001, police were actively looking for Braae. He knew his time was limited, which may have created a nothing-to-lose mentality. Susan's murder wasn't an isolated incident or a crime of passion. It was part of a pattern, part of a spree by a man who had been killing for years, and would have continued if he hadn't been caught. One question that haunts any case like this: could the victim have been saved? In Susan's case, the evidence strongly suggests she was killed on or very shortly after. June 24, 2001. She was never seen or heard from again after that date. She didn't use her credit cards or access any money. She didn't contact family or friends. Braae continued using her truck, suggesting he knew she wouldn't be needing it when Braae was captured on July 20, 2001. He was still driving Susan's pickup truck. If Susan had been alive somewhere, held captive, this would have been discovered after his arrest. The fact that no location where she was being held was ever found suggests she was already dead, based on all available evidence. The most likely scenario is this: Susan and Braae argued outside the trailer in the early morning hours of June 24, 2001. The argument escalated to violence, and Braae murdered Susan. He placed her body in the back of his pickup truck, possibly her own truck. He drove along Highway 4. Looking for a remote location to dispose of the body, he found a suitable location in the KM mountain area and hid Susan's body in the forest. He kept her truck and continued using it. Later, realizing he still had her purse and credit cards, he disposed of them at a rest stop near Castle Rock. He moved on to his next victims, believing Susan's body would never be found. For 20 years, he was right. The forest kept Susan's secret. But ultimately, even forests give up their dead. Susan Ault's identification after more than 23 years represents a triumph of modern forensic science. Let's examine how this was possible and what it means for other cold cases. When remains have been exposed to the elements for 2 decades, DNA extraction becomes exponentially more difficult. Rain, heat, cold, bacteria, insects, animals, all of these factors degrade genetic material. Soft tissue is the first to go, which is why only Susan's partial skull was found. Bone, however, can preserve DNA for much longer than soft tissue, even after years of exposure. Bone can retain enough genetic material for analysis, but extracting and amplifying that DNA requires sophisticated techniques. The tests used in Susan's case were described as DNA genealogy tests that utilize DNA from family members and are considered extremely accurate. This likely refers to a process where DNA is extracted from the bone remains that DNA profile is compared against reference samples from known family. Member statistical analysis determines the likelihood of familial relationship if the match is strong enough. Identification is confirmed specifically. The Wahkiakum County Sheriff's Office obtained a DNA sample from Susan's daughter. A mother-daughter match is particularly strong because children inherit half their DNA from each parent. If the remains DNA profile shows the expected maternal markers matching the daughter's DNA, that's compelling evidence of identity. The identification was made possible by the Washington State Physical Anthropologist's Office and Bode Technology Group. Bode Technology is a leading forensic laboratory specializing in DNA analysis, particularly for difficult cases involving degraded samples. They've worked on numerous high-profile cold cases, using cutting-edge technology to extract and analyze DNA that would have been impossible to work with just a decade or two ago. The remains were found in February 2021, but not identified until November 2024. Why the delay? Several factors likely contributed. Initial processing. The remains had to be properly documented, examined by forensic anthropologists, and prepared for DNA extraction. DNA extraction, getting usable DNA from degraded bone, is time-consuming and may require multiple attempts. Finding reference samples. Investigators had to identify potential matches from missing persons cases and contact family members for comparison samples. Laboratory backlog. Forensic laboratories often have backlogs of cases. With limited resources and high demand, multiple testing to ensure accuracy. DNA testing may be performed multiple times using different methods. Legal verification. Before publicly announcing an identification, authorities need to be certain. The scientific evidence must be reviewed and confirmed. Susan's identification demonstrates that even decades-old cases can be solved with modern technology. As Coroner Dan Bigelow noted, with the help of experts like Kathy Taylor from the Washington State Physical Anthropologist's Office, there hasn't been an unidentified set of remains found in Wahkiakum County in the last 1215 years that has not been identified. This success rate represents hope for other families waiting for answers about missing loved ones. The technology continues to improve, the databases continue to grow, and cases that seemed unsolvable are being resolved. Following the identification, Susan Ault's case has been reclassified from a missing person case to a homicide investigation. This reclassification is significant. It means investigators are now actively working to build a murder case, not just searching for a missing person. After 23 years, what evidence could possibly remain that would help prosecute Susan's killer? Forensic analysis of remains. Even with only partial remains, forensic pathologists may be able to determine cause of death. Certain types of trauma leave marks on bone. If Susan was shot, there might be bone damage. If she was struck with a heavy object, there might be fractures with specific characteristics. DNA evidence beyond identification. There's the possibility of finding DNA from someone other than Susan on her remains. However, after 20 years of environmental exposure, this is unlikely. Location evidence. Investigators can analyze the specific location where Susan's remains were found. Were there any items buried with her? Were there any fibers, clothing remnants, or other materials that survived? How far off the road was she found? What does the location tell us about the killer's familiarity with the area? Historical evidence. Detectives can review all the original evidence from 2001. Phone records, witness statements, timeline reconstructions. With the benefit of hindsight and knowing where the body was ultimately found, patterns might emerge that weren't apparent before. Braae's prison statements. Has Braae ever made statements to fellow inmates, guards, or others about Susan's disappearance? Prison conversations are often monitored, and confessions or admissions made to cellmates have solved cold cases before re-interviewing. Witnesses. People who were interviewed in 2001 might remember additional details now, or might be more willing to share information after so much time has passed, even with Susan's remains identified and the case reclassified as homicide. Prosecuting Michael Braae for her murder faces significant challenges. Time, 23 years have passed. Memories fade. Witnesses may have died or moved away. Evidence. The physical evidence has been exposed to elements for 2 decades. Braae's refusal to cooperate. When Detective Bulch traveled out of state to question Braae about Susan's disappearance, Braae refused to talk. He's unlikely to confess now. Double jeopardy issues. While Braae wasn't charged with Susan's murder before, prosecutors need to be careful not to bring weak charges that could result in acquittal, which would prevent future prosecution. Michael Braae is already serving a 48-year sentence for Lori Jones' murder. He's unlikely to be released in his lifetime. So why continue investigating Susan's case? Several reasons. Justice for Susan. Every victim deserves justice. Deserves to have their murderer held accountable for their specific crime. Closure for family. A conviction would provide additional closure for Susan's family, particularly her daughter and sister. Historical record. A conviction establishes the official historical record of what happened and who was responsible. Setting precedent. Successfully prosecuting very old cold cases encourages continued work on other unsolved cases, even after 23 years. Someone might know something. Someone might have heard Braae talking about Susan. Someone might have seen something unusual in June 2001. Someone might have information about the KM Mountain area or why that specific location was chosen. If you have any information about this case now, matter how insignificant it might seem, please contact the Wahkiakum County Sheriff's Office. Susan Ault's case offers painful lessons about criminal justice, domestic violence, predatory behavior, and the long shadow cast by violence. Michael Braae had 42 convictions before his 2001 crime spree. He was supposed to be under supervision by the Washington State Department of Corrections. But due to a paperwork mix-up and misclassification as a low-risk offender when he should have been classified as high-risk, the doc lost track of him. This wasn't a failure by one person. This was a systemic failure. A man with 42 convictions, including violent offenses, was classified as low-risk. He wasn't properly supervised. He was free to continue preying on vulnerable women. If the system had worked as intended, Susan Ault and Lori Jones would likely be alive today. Marshall Morgan wouldn't have a bullet in her brain. Karen Peterson wouldn't have been assaulted. The families? $6.4 million settlement with the state was an acknowledgement of this failure. But no amount of money can undo the harm caused. The lesson? Parole and probation supervision is not just bureaucratic paperwork. It's a matter of life and death. Every misclassification, every missed check-in, every lost file potentially puts lives at risk. Michael Braae specifically targeted women with troubles and needs. Women who were vulnerable, who were in difficult circumstances, who were looking for connection. Susan Ault fit this pattern perfectly. She was struggling with addiction. She'd experienced homelessness. She'd had a string of failed relationships. She was looking for stability. For someone who might understand her struggles. Predators recognize vulnerability and exploit it. They offer what seems like comfort, understanding, or rescue. But their kindness is a trap. The lesson: society needs to better support vulnerable women with addiction services, mental health support, housing assistance, and domestic violence resources. When women have strong support networks and resources, they're less likely to fall prey to predators. Authorities suspected Braae in multiple murders, dating back to 1997, Valina Larson and Deborah Van Leuven. But he wasn't stopped. He wasn't locked away. He continued to move through communities, meeting women, forming relationships, and leaving bodies in his wake. Why wasn't the pattern recognized earlier? Why wasn't more done? Part of the answer is resources. Wahkiakum County had one detective. Smaller jurisdictions lack the manpower and resources of major cities. When murders happen in different counties or different states, connecting the dots becomes harder. But part of the answer is also about who we prioritize. When women from the margins of society, homeless women, women struggling with addiction, women who work in bars, disappear, do we investigate with the same vigor as when someone from a more privileged background vanishes? Lori Ault noted with frustration that while congressional intern Chandra Levy's disappearance made national headlines, Susan's case received little attention. Lori worked alone to tie up the loose ends of her sister's life. The lesson: every missing person deserves the full resources of law enforcement, regardless of their background, lifestyle, or circumstances. A pattern killer should be stopped after the first victim, not after the fourth or fifth. Lori Ault spent years searching for her sister. She walked forests. She studied maps. She tried to think like a killer to determine where Susan might have been taken. Eventually, Lori had to accept that her searches might never find Susan, but as she said, she was waiting for fate to find her. And fate, the form of modern forensic science and dedicated investigators, did find Susan. 20 years later, but Susan was found. The lesson: cold cases can be solved. Decades may pass, but advances in technology, fresh eyes on old evidence, and persistent investigation can bring answers. Families should never lose hope that resolution might come. Looking back at Susan's case, were there warning signs that she was in danger? Yes. Susan and Braae were heard arguing shortly before she disappeared. Arguments that escalate to the point where witnesses take notice are a red flag in any relationship. But Susan, like many people in abusive or dangerous relationships, likely didn't recognize the full danger until it was too late. Her sister Lori described Susan as someone who stubbornly felt she could handle the men in her life the same way. She handled difficult horses. The lesson: if someone you care about is in a relationship marked by arguments, control, isolation, or violence, reach out. Offer support. Provide resources. Keep lines of communication open. You can't force someone to leave a dangerous situation, but you can make sure they know they have options and people who care. Susan Ault was more than a victim. She was a person who loved horses. She was a sister who was loved deeply. She was a mother who had a daughter. She had dreams and struggles and moments of joy. When we talk about serial killers, there's a tendency to focus on the killer, to analyze their psychology, to try to understand what made them capable of such evil. But in doing so, we risk forgetting the people they destroyed. The lesson: every victim was a person with a full life, with people who loved them, with unrealized potential. We honor them not just by solving their cases, but by remembering their humanity. On a February day in 2021, someone walking in the KM Mountain area of Wahkiakum County found a skull. They probably had no idea of the story behind it. No idea that this discovery would finally answer a 20-year-old question in November 2024. That skull was given a name, Susan Lynn Ault, for Susan's daughter. Now an adult who grew up without her mother, this identification provides certainty. She knows what happened. She knows where her mother was all these years. She can mourn properly now, with knowledge instead of endless questions. For Lori Ault, who spent years searching forests and highways, who lived with the daily torture of not knowing, this identification validates everything she suspected. She believed Susan had been killed and dumped along a highway corridor. She was right. The identification doesn't bring Susan back. It doesn't undo the trauma of her murder. It doesn't erase 23 years of grief and uncertainty. but it provides something that families of the missing crave desperately: answers. Susan Ault's case demonstrates why we must never give up on missing persons cases. Technology advances. New techniques emerge. What couldn't be solved in 2001 can be solved in 2024. Her case also demonstrates the vital importance of properly supervising dangerous criminals. Michael Braae should never have been free to kill Susan and Lori Jones. The system failed, and women died because of that failure. Perhaps Susan's legacy can be better systems, better supervision, better protection for vulnerable women. Perhaps it can be the knowledge that even decades-old cases can be solved, encouraging continued work on the thousands of unsolved missing persons cases across America. Michael "Cowboy Mike Braae sits in prison today, serving his sentence for Lori Jones' murder. He's never been held accountable for Susan's death, never charged, never convicted. He's never admitted to killing her, but Susan's identification changes the equation. Investigators now know it's not just a missing person case, it's a murder. They know where she was found. They can analyze whatever evidence remains. And perhaps, even after 23 years, charges may yet be filed. Braae is currently housed at the Washington State Penitentiary under strict supervision. He attempted to escape multiple times over the years. But he won't escape justice for Susan Ault. Maybe you lived in Wahkiakum County in 2001. Maybe you knew Susan. Maybe you heard something, saw something, noticed something that didn't make sense at the time. Even after 23 years, your information could matter. Your tip could be the piece investigators need to bring formal charges and ensure Susan's killer is held fully accountable. On June 24, 2001, in the early morning hours, Susan Lynn Ault's life ended in violence. For 7,668 days, that's how many days are in 23 years her family lived with uncertainty. Her body lay in the forest, unnamed, unknown, waiting to be found. But science spoke her name. Dedicated investigators never stopped working. And finally, Susan came home. She was 39 years old when she died. She loved horses. She had a passion for life despite her struggles. She had a sister who never stopped searching for her. She had a daughter who grew up without her. She was Susan Lynn Ault, and after 23 years of silence, her story has finally been told. Rest in peace, Susan. Your voice has been heard. Your story has been told, and you will not be forgotten. This video is dedicated to Susan Lynn Ault and all victims of violence who have been forgotten or overlooked. May their stories be told and their memories honored. If you have information about unsolved missing persons cases, please contact your local law enforcement or the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. Name us at namus.gov. Special thanks to the investigators, forensic scientists, and advocates who work tirelessly to bring answers to families of the missing.